Catherine has been great. Everybody's been great. Food is awesome. I love the apple thing. We gave you a name for it. So.
Hold that mic
It's
right.
an apple thing. So, yeah, it's great. I've never really been up to the center. It's really good, nice place to go. I am working with the Discovery Center down the way. And can you hear me now? And so we're trying to get some history together of Native people in the area, Native use of the area, what possibly could be done. Talking to the audience today that said they had information. It'd be really cool to hear more from them, maybe some stories, because there's not really a lot about this area that's been collected and really written down. So we need to have more. Part of the problem with that is in this area, there wasn't like a major tribe that lived here. There were people that came through, traveled trails, maybe stayed here for a few months in the summertime or late summer about this time and were maybe fishing or picking berries or something. But there wasn't there wasn't like permanent villages in this area that we know of. And so that's a little bit of a problem because they didn't
I know,
nobody
you
really
can't
passed on
hear
much
back here.
information.
You can't hear
Still
back
can't
here.
Sorry. We should put like a space up here. Everybody can't hear well. Just up here.
You need a better mic.
Anyway, so it's very bright. It's very cool. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, that's better. It's kind of cutting in and out, so I'll try and make it right. But all right, so
That's better.
let me get started. This is actually a double presentation. Part of it is about the book, and I do have copies for sale. There's a few on the table. I have more in my car if you need them. I have sold a few. I will sign other books if you have them. And I know people have been buying it over the last year. It's only been on a year. So, I do take cash. I have Venmo. I use Venmo, and I have a credit card reader, so that works too. I actually got one to work. So, so double presentation. First part is about the book. The second part is about further sort of research I'm doing in more sort of environmental sector. So, okay. Gotta go. All right, so here's the cover. The cover image I picked from a friend of mine's art. His name is Greg Robinson. He's a member of the Chinook Nation. Lives up in Vancouver, Washington, and he's a Native American artist. Does a lot of carving, does public art, and he does this painting style, which is pretty interesting. Very, I don't know, ethereal in some ways. But I like this one because it had this sort of definite sort of valley look to it, rolling hills and long houses, which is what we assume that the Californians lived in. So it is a piece of art, and if you happen to want to buy it just for that purpose, I'm happy with that too. So this is the contents of the book. I have numerous chapters that sort of lay out historically. I'm really more interested in what's happening in the valley, Californians, Molalla, and Clackamas peoples almost exclusively in the book. Other stories are talked about, like I'll go into sometimes the wars in the area, because they do explain things like federal Indian policy that followed or was parallel with the wars and other conflicts with tribes. And so I'll explain that, talk a little bit about the coast reservation, a little bit about the Columbia, things like that, but it's all an explanation of why, what happened with the Californians, what happened to the Wall people, why they moved to the reservation, and why they're treated like they were treated, losing all the land. What I'm looking at is interactions between the tribes and settlers. It's not always a pretty story or a nice story. It is a story from, at least as far as I can figure, their perspective, Native people's perspectives. Even though I didn't live back then, I tried to think about what they would have been thinking about at the time they were losing the land. So that you can imagine that's a pretty extreme situation. So I'll go through some of the stuff in the presentation today. Some of the stuff I'll leave for your imagination once you read the book and you can figure it out. So, and then I'm only really into the colonization era and then continued colonization efforts that were happening at the reservation itself. The federal government had their own ideas and theories about how to treat Native peoples, what they should be striving to be, and through assimilation, and so that plays out largely in the 19th century and the early 20th century. So that's kind of the book. So why I wrote this? Really kind of, you know, I kind of grew up in Oregon. I grew up in Salem, Oregon. In my education, I was never really taught about Native peoples. I'm a member of the Grand Ronde tribe now, and a descendant of the Calapooians, the Molalla, the Takelma, the Chinook peoples of Western Oregon, but I was never taught about that in school. And that's probably the story for 99% of people in this audience. You were never really taught about the history of the tribes, tribal history at all, and really all you've really gotten is maybe a few things you read in books yourself, maybe in college, you took an archaeology class or anthropology class, and then maybe the rest of that would be urban legend, you know, stuff you hear in the community. So, and so that's kind of where we're all at. It's not just a problem of my generation, it's a problem of every generation in Oregon. And so now we are in this time period where we're trying to fix that. Native people are now going to college, they are now writing things, researching things, and they want to get their perspectives out on their own histories, their own stories. And so that was never really accessed by historians and researchers in the past. They kind of ignored what we had to say about that, what our thoughts are, our feelings were about losing all of our land. And so now we have an opportunity to write that stuff, and that's the book. I'm not trying to write a holistic history of Oregon where everybody's perspective is there. I don't have to. Your library here has some of these history books already about Oregon history, and they already have the non-native perspective of it. So you can get that through those books pretty easily, or online or somewhere else. I'm writing the other side of that history, what happened to Native peoples, what they experienced from their perspectives. And that's not, again, always a pretty thing. And then we're looking at you know, what happened in our education system, their education system, why they were put into boarding schools, things like assimilation, lots of things that were happening first on the reservation, or sometimes before the reservation, and trying to explain how that affected tribes. I also offer, when I sent the first manuscript to the press, it's an independent press, and they wanted a little more excitement. They said it was kind of boring. So I guess a lot of historians don't necessarily write for excitement, but so they wanted me to have more personal perspectives. What did I experience when I am learning about these things for the first time as a Native American, where my family literally went through these things, went through these histories. And so what does that mean to me? And so I did write a few short essays, kind of like intros to sections that address you know, my learning about Crooked Finger Prairie, or learning about where the Sandiam homeland was, that where my people came from, or things like that. So I have these personal perspectives in there, and that I think makes it interesting. Hopefully, you can let me know. I don't know. So, and I want to be as accurate as possible. A lot of the history books, some of them are pretty old now, outdated, I would say, but they tend to sort of live and thrive in libraries still. And they have a lot of inaccurate information on them. And they don't take the perspective of Native peoples at all. So sometimes those histories are just totally inaccurate. They don't really know what they're doing. A lot of historians would copy what was written in the previous generation of historians. So that becomes scientifically what we call a house of cards, where if the first piece of information is wrong, the 10th one is also going to be wrong if they didn't go back and check their work, right? So scientifically that shouldn't happen, but it does. It has, and I can show you where it is. So, so I go back and I try and correct that information, correct the dates, correct the time periods, correct the happenings, as much as possible, correct the names sometimes, sometimes the name's wrong. So these are situations I have had to deal with for years, not really knowing what exactly to do with that, but, realizing that I have to correct it in my generation since I know better. And then I wanted to use a more accessible style. I am an academic. I didn't write academically. It doesn't have a heavily anthropologically stilted language. It's a more common language so that the book can be used by the public, by schools, like high schools, even perhaps grade schools, and in college. So it does sort of span these different areas so that it's a more general history that anybody can actually read and appreciate. And I mentioned a few people that does have actually very large print. I didn't plan that. It's not something that I asked for, but the print is very large, so anybody should be able to enjoy it. Yes. So, one of the questions I get a lot, because I've done presentations now for some 15 years or so in the area, is people come to me and say, hey, what about those smallpox blankets? Well, I'm like, well, we don't have a lot of records about smallpox blankets in the Northwest. There are perhaps some incidences that happened 400 years ago on the East Coast, or I just heard a couple days ago perhaps a thing that happened with the Blackfeet 150 years ago, but that's not Oregon. And so a lot of even Native people will come to me and say, but those smallpox, I'm like, we don't have no recorded cases of people spreading around blankets that have smallpox in them and spreading disease in that manner. In fact, smallpox was not the major disease here. What we think is that malaria was the problem. I'm going to read this whole thing, you can read if you want, but malaria was the major problem. It arrived about 1830, probably in the bodies of fur traders that had been through the tropics, picked up malaria. We have a similar species of mosquito here, the Anopheles mosquito in the valley, and that can carry the virus. So those mosquitoes picked it up, passed it around, took a few years to get down to the South Valley. Probably didn't get to the Eugene area, Lane County area until 1832 or 33. So it took a few years to get there. But we have a problem where I've been doing some research on Lane County, Native peoples, not finding a lot of people in the Sun Valley. And I'm not sure why. And it could be that they were hit later by the disease and they did not recover as fast as the North Valley. So that's what I'm thinking right now. But anyway, so what happened when people went through the disease, we saw a 95 to 97% decline. And so that means that if there had been 10 villages that were part of a tribe, they had reduced down to 1. And that was it. And those are the survivors that are sort of grouping together for safety and security and whatever. So, so that's a huge problem. It caused changes in tribes. Many tribes probably disappeared. Many tribes appeared for the first time. New confederations rose. And so we see a different structure in the whole region for all the different tribes than was previously there. And so sometimes you'll hear tribal names that you don't see really kind of listed in details from the 1850s or even today, but they're older tribes that somewhat disappeared before the malaria. They disappeared because of malaria. So, and that's part of a problem that we as historians have to deal with, because literally the history before 1830 is different from the history after 1830. It's just completely different in many areas. On the Columbia, in the Valley, in many areas. And part of the problem is that anthropology was not really born as a science until around the 1890s. So tribes had already been on the reservations for 40 years before anthropologists really got busy to collecting things like information about them, about stories or whatever. And so what we have then is some early sort of naturalists that collected some things, a few linguists that were out there collecting some things, and a lot of journals and letters and other archival documents. And so that's what we really have. We have a few explorers accounts that are pretty good. Lewis and Clark is really good for the Columbia, not good for the valley because they didn't really come to the valley. We have explorers that came through the valley that, McKenzie, for whatever reason, didn't collect to have a journal, but McKenzie was here, and his compatriots that were with him did write some stuff down, talked about tribes a little bit, and we have some fur trade era things which are pretty interesting, and a few odd explorers like David Douglas comes through the valley. I think tribes thought he was really an oddball because he was sometimes by himself, walking through the valley collecting seeds, and people were like, "Why are you doing that? You're odd." So they kind of left him alone because they were kind of afraid of him. They're like, "What are you doing?" So anyway, so that's what we have, and so we have to sort of read through the lines. Sometimes these people are very biased in the way they look at Native peoples. They talk about them as dirty savages. So that kind of language of sort of that era is not very helpful, but it gives us an idea about what they were thinking about Native peoples and how to filter through their knowledge, the knowledge they were passing on through their stories of what could be real and what could be the sort of imagined thing. All right. Enough about that. Okay, so one of the things I'm really excited about, and I'll get into more of this later, is this idea of looking at environmental history as history of the tribe. Early on, and we've talked about, people have heard of things like settler colonization as kind of a thing nowadays, and this is a big subject that a lot of students are studying in college, this idea of settler colonization, this idea that the things that settlers did caused conditions such that Native people were dispossessed of all their lands, all their properties, all their money, all their wealth for the last 200 years. And we are living in that future, that kind of a post-apocalyptic future for us. And I call it the post-apocalyptic future because it is, in a real sense, for Native people, the post-apocalypse, right? We've lost everything. So, and so that's one area that what I've been trying to do is going back into the past as much as I can, into records of the valley, and figuring out what the environment of the valley was. Because we have a lot of assumptions. People can make up anything they want to. I've heard of stories about the valley that, it was full of trees. I'm like, that's not true. We have all these prairies. And then some people today even are coming to me and asking about whether or not there was salmon in the valley at all. And I said, yes, there was. And so because the salmon were coming up to the falls, and we know that there is a spring, at least a spring run, if not a fall run. So we do have salmon even today in the valley. So there's lots of stuff behind that. And so what I'm doing is trying to figure out what the environment was actually like from the accounts at the time period. And come to find out that everything that we think we know is probably not true. And I'll go into more of that later. But back in the day, the things that were happening that we see accounts of are Native people, like let's say in the North Valley, that we call the Pudding River Calapooians, were some of the first to be colonized in the area. And we had these settlers and these fur traders that were out of contract that settled in the valley. Some of them had Indian wives. And they began putting all the land that they claimed into farms or pasturage. And this is all French Prairie, right? And so that land became a really super productive landscape, and it is today even, because it was normally sort of washed by the waters of the Willamette River occasionally. All the nutrients from the river would come onto the land and made it super, super productive, plus there's lots of water. So, but when tribes were, after they sort of began to adjust to these new people living around the area, they began to lose all their little fields of camas and other plants that they were harvesting food from. And in time, in a very short time, within 10 years, the whole of French Prairie was occupied by settlers, and there was absolutely no land for Native people left. So their food sources went away completely. And so those people had to sort of live that changed their economies, changed who they were, and lived at the behest of the settlers. Sometimes they lived on the edge of their properties, or in a river draw, or someplace nobody wanted to live. And they were taking wage labor at the farms. They were like helping harvest things. They were learning how to do building like in Western style. They were doing all kinds of things on farms. And so that completely changed everything for the tribes. And that is not just a change in culture, it's environmental change too. You're completely applying a new philosophy of how to properly use your land to an area that was natural, and Native people did not farm. They would harvest crops, but they would not plow, they would not change river systems, they would not do anything that would destroy the land itself, destroy the native land itself. They allowed the sort of native plants and animals to grow as they would, and then they harvest the proceeds from that. So that is a completely different philosophy, right? And so when the whole valley gets that way, and by 1851 or 2, it was said the whole valley, the whole Willamette Valley is claimed. There is not enough parcels in the valley to put Native peoples on a reservation in the valley, so we have to move them outside the valley. That means that there was not enough land in the valley to feed all those people that were dependent on native plants and animals. So what were they doing? They were starving, and they began to steal from their neighbors, from the white settlers, right? Because a lot of times we have stories from Brownsville, native people coming to the farm and saying, hey, we're starving, can we have some food? And the farmers would say, no, we grew that food, it's our food, you can't have it here. Even though perhaps a few years earlier, these same native people had helped them build their farm. So you see there's a problem here. So that overexploitation of the valley, overdevelopment, began pushing native peoples to the periphery, making them into problematic people. They were problematic because they began to steal things, they began to cause problems. So the settlers began to complain, and that caused the Bureau of Indian Affairs to have to move them somewhere on the reservations. So that's the beginning of everything. And so later on, in the 20th century, we see more effects like that. All right, so I also go in the book onto the reservations themselves. So the reservation is not really looked at well by historians. I was able to get into federal records, look at the federal accounts from Bureau of Indian Affairs, from the Department of War, from generals, things like that, things they wrote, communications between each other. And so I wrote most of the sections on the reservation from that. Let me read this piece to you. When natives came first to the reservation, they were all relieved of their weapons. They could not hunt. Many of them were unfamiliar with the Northern Territory, did not know where wild foods grew, like camas berries, or where the good fishing rivers were. The tribes had instantly changed their diets from wild foods that they caught, hunted, or gathered, or dug, to beef, pork, flour, oil, and some vegetables. These are foods that Native people had little experience with. The tribes were completely at the mercy of federal agents and the environment, and the sudden cumulative changes of 1856 contributed to malnutrition and sicknesses. So some 4,000 Native people from all West Oregon were moved through Grand Ronde and put on the coast, essentially where Lincoln City and Newport is today. And so those 4,000 people had to be fed. People on the coast could kind of usually feed themselves because they were in the estuaries. People at Grand Ronde didn't really know where the resources were. And then they were, like I said, the weapons were taken away because there was fear that they would leave the reservation and attack what was called the white settlements in the valley. So they were completely dependent on the food they were given. And so the Indian agents were buying food from farmers in the valley, and they would have to wait for that transport of that beef or pork or whatever onto the reservation. There are stories on the reservation of people when they first got pork not knowing what to do with it and throwing it out because it was so smelly and greasy, and they didn't know what that was. And so one woman who had been helping out, sort of like being something of a maid or cook or something for people in Oregon City, had learned how to use pork, and she showed them how to render it down, render out the fat, and then cook with the fat. And so that was the story. We had that story, and so it's very interesting. I can't imagine what we have to adjust to in that situation. People didn't like beef, didn't know what beef was. And so these people also, when they came to the reservation, many of them had come out of the war. Rotary Wars had just happened. There were wars in the Columbia. Many people, the Rotary Wars. And then the wars in the Columbia happened, and then we had also people who had gone through near genocidal events where most of their villages had been wiped out by the militias. And then people who had, just a generation before, lost most of their people through things like malaria or other diseases. So people were not healthy. They were traumatized in many ways at the reservation. So I believe all these cumulative changes and effects on the reservation cause everybody to be sick. And we see a lot of death in the first few years. I think about half the tribe died in about 5 years because they were completely traumatized. They were not getting the support, adequate support from the federal government, which was I actually was reading this account the other day. The doctor who first came to Grand Ronde when it was first being settled by the tribes, he came in like March or something, and he saw how much illness was on the reservation on his first report, and he prescribed for them tea. Literally, that's what he prescribed. Because they didn't have the medicines, nothing. So, it was also rice. So tea and rice, that's what he prescribed. They didn't know what rice was either, so that's another thing. So I wrote that down because I thought it was amazing to see a doctor prescribe that and then take off, go back to his home, sending a list of medications, and a long list that was 2 pages long, to the Indian agent to buy.
Yeah.
So, yeah, there was a lot of problems there. I'll try.
So, quick question, sorry. What is camas?
Camas is a bulb. It kind of grows in the prairies and valleys. And there's some growing up here in this area too, some of the prairies. But it's a bulb that people eat.
Washington has a big campus.
Don't eat the flower.
Vancouver.
Eat the bulb. But you got to cook it. All right. So people came to the reservation. They also didn't have a lot of food. Some people had to sort of learn to sort of forage for themselves in the area of forests around the coast range. And people began to adopt a new culture of leaving the reservation, going into the valley and working for farmers. And so it's pretty commonly known that Native and Grand Ronde would go places like Woodland and Salem and Independence to pick hops in later days. They would make a little bit of money and then come back and maybe harvest whatever fields they had on the reservation. There wasn't hardly any wage labor jobs at the reservation. I think there was 6. And generally, the agents would hire white men in the area, like farmers in the area, to do that work. They would get paid. I think the accounts I saw is the white men doing the job of making a fence would get $12 a month. A Native person doing the same job would get $6 a month. So it's very clear for some people on the reservation that if you stop identifying as Indian and left the reservation, you get paid twice the wage. So, and we see a lot of that. We see a lot of sort of disappearances from the reservation. People stopped identifying as Native if they could, if they had already crossbred and their skin was light enough. They could go move to a place like Oregon City and work in the industries there and get paid twice the wage by stopping identifying as Native. So we see that. But a lot of other people began going to the valley and becoming the first migrant farm laborers. We see people from Sept, Grand Ronde, Willamette, and Warm Springs doing that. And that became a thing that went on for like 100 years in the valley here. Some of the stories I've heard tonight of the Warm Springs coming through the area, camping, and then going on to maybe Springfield or Eugene to work in hop fields and the seed fields in Springfield. That's part of that tradition. Warm Springs people would come or mountain passes. It was always a thing for them to come into the mountains and pick huckleberries or other berries, or later on maybe acorns, from white oaks and stuff like that. And then they also apparently fish a lot of rivers up here. But going into Eugene, they actually were able to plug into that economy down there, become pretty well-known, respected laborers in the hop fields down there too. So that's an interesting story that I began developing, because we didn't know much about that. We do have some pictures of the camps in Springfield, and we do have these stories of them bringing like leather products with them and selling them or trading them to people in the area. In fact, we found at least 3 artifacts in the Lane County Museum, two gloves and a vest that look like they're made by Native people, have beadwork on them, and could be from that time period where it's described these Native people coming over with their ponies, camping out in these sort of Indian camps, either at Hendricks Bridge Park nowadays or along the Coast Fork, and then trading their stuff in town to Eugene people or Springfield people. That could be the case. I've heard stories up here of people saying the same thing. So that tracks really well. And the beadwork in these 2 gloves at Lake County Museum are not that awesome. I mean, they're like, and the story is that a lot of the children would do this. The children would make these gloves as kind of a side gig, and then through the wintertime they would make gloves using whatever they have, do beadwork on there, and they would sell that to local farmers for work gloves. So that looks like, the beadwork actually looks like kids' beadwork, if you can imagine what that is. So there you go. So that was a pretty constant thing. That went on into the 1950s until termination hit the area. And then the biggest, I think, change was with the Bracero movement, where the laws brought in, U.S. laws brought in Mexicans to work in the fields in the area, in California and Oregon, Arizona, places like that. You could pay them less and give them worse conditions to live in, and make more money if you're a farmer. So that kind of destroyed the sort of economy for tribes. I also think that tribal people in the 1940s began, we know they were hired by Kaiser shipyards in Portland to help build ships. And some of those stories of the Roses River type stories were actually Native women who were actually welding ships in the Kaiser shipyards in Portland. And they were from like Warm Springs or Grand Ronde or the reservations in the area. So that became a more lucrative place to go get work than trampsing over the field, over the mountains here to go to Springfield to work in the hop fields.
She's a character.
So that completely changed the whole economy in the area. So it was all that stuff.
Did you just use the word termination like it was a thing?
Yeah, what
It
is
was.
that?
It was a federal program called termination.
Are you going to talk more about
Maybe.
that?
Let's wait until afterwards and come back to that question. Okay, so I actually have a dissertation on that, so I could talk for a couple hours on that. Really want to know. You're able to know. So there's a lot of stories of unequal treatment, and these stories sometimes come from Native people themselves. So we have some good ones from a couple chiefs at the reservation. Chiefs were kind of responsible for speaking out when they saw injustice and stuff. This meeting took place in it was like 1871, I believe, and they brought all the chiefs from all the reservations to Salem, to the Methodist Church, and they had a big meeting. And it was federal Indian agents and Methodist ministers kind of lecturing these chiefs about how to live, which is a really interesting situation nowadays, but whatever. So the chiefs of the reservation pushed back against Bruno's words, decided they had been taught to drink by whites, and everyone seemed to be drinking gambling anyway, so why stop? They wanted equal treatment. They explained how poor everything was on the reservation, that they had no resources, and the promises of land sales and treaty making had not worked. They were still poor while the whites got rich, They revealed that the white Indian agents were not following the laws. The United States was not appropriately following their agreements and the treaties of giving allotments and funding for the needs at the reservations. So that was interesting statement. They would go on for a while talking about these things. Agents were trying to get them to accept white medicine, basically go away from native doctors, to send their kids to school, to stop gambling, to sort of live a more moral life, a more Christian life. And it's all part of this notion of assimilating to an American lifestyle, which was at that time meant to be white Christian, way of living. And so that's kind of what was being happening here. Also, we have this one from 1872 from Chief Louis Nipissing and other chiefs of the reservation who signed a petition they sent to President U.S. Grant. I have now been on the reservation 16 years. During that time, I have seen poor white men come here as officers of and stay a few years and be rich, while I and all my people have always been growing poor. We at first had a great deal of money. We came here in agreement with the terms of our treaty, but my people have never got much benefit from that money. Our superintendents and agents have got all of it. Well, I have seen the people die for want of food, just as our horses die in the winter. The men you have sent here for our officers have not only stolen our money, but have violated our women and scattered diseases among us, which have reduced our numbers from thousands to hundreds. So when people, like I said, first moved onto the reservations, there were some 4,000. About 2,000, or actually 1,200 remained at Grand Ronde in 1857, after some of the people moved over to Sept. By 1900, there were 400 people or less at Grand Ronde. And that's not all death by disease or mistreatment. Some of that is, like I said, people leaving and wanting to sort of find a better job somewhere else. Stop identifying as native. We see a lot of that happening. But that's pretty extreme loss of population. Again, these people are really aware of things. They're not just passive recipients of history. What's happening in history, they're saying what's happening on the reservation. We don't know if they got an answer from Ulysses S. Grant. We do know that a couple years earlier, when he was elected office, he did say he would offer a path to citizenship for any native people that basically were civilized. And it took until 1924 for there to be a law passed to allow native people, all native people in the U.S. to become citizens of the United States. So even these people never saw that citizenship. So the promises of the government are not always good. So many times what I'm doing in my book is trying to fix history, rewrite it, write perspectives that you probably haven't seen before. So I've researched native peoples for a long time, some 25 years. Mostly, for me, it's almost like genealogy because it's my family. And so I'm really kind of writing this really extensive genealogy of my family. So that's kind of what I'm doing. I'm trying to tell that story as best I can with respect to peoples of the past. I'm not going to read all this stuff for you because I want to move on to the next step. But so I'm just trying to fix that history. So the next piece is I call it reconstructing traditional indigenous environments in the Willamette Valley. So this is a really nice sort of image of the valley. I like it because it's a little more closer to probably what everything was like. This was taken, I believe, in the fall last year. I went on to a hill, kind of by Salem, by Eola area. I looked out south, and I saw all this sort of wetland area. This probably was more closer to what everything was like in the valley before everything was changed. And I'll show you why. So I really got interested a couple years ago in these what happened to places like Wapato Lake and Lake Labiche outside of Salem, or this one's outside of Gaston, Oregon, really south of Hillsboro area. And So Wapito Lake was a pretty well-known lake. It was talked about in native ethnographies in the Tualatin as like a major sort of resource where they would gather wapito, this bulb right down here. Really major. It was so respected as a food that even settlers who came to the area use it as a food. They call it Indian potatoes. And they replaced the potato with this for a few years before they could actually grow potatoes. It grew in large patches like this, in many ponds and lakes, and along at the edges of the Columbia. In fact, the whole Portland Basin appeared to be the mecca for wapito, where a lot of people in the fall would move into the Portland Basin and harvest wapito like crazy, and then take whatever proceeds they got from that in the spring back to their home villages upriver or somewhere else. It turns out that that Wapito Lake, this is an image I was able to get off GLO maps, the GLO maps online from the DLM. I colored it. This is the lake itself. This is a wetland that comes down to the south into the hills. So this lake complex is much, much larger than just the lake. It's all the wetlands that surround it. And the stories in newspapers were that farmers, like this guy, probably this guy, and this guy, that put their plots next to the lake really wanted to get sort of into the lake as much as they can because the soil is nice, black, peat soil that grows really anything really well. And the problem is we have a lot of rain in Oregon, so when the rain comes, all this rain comes down, all it drains down here from the hills, and then becomes a giant lake that floods out all of these fields. It's called ponding or swaling in the valley. And the settlers are really upset. They're like, I want to use all my land to farm. I don't want to use like 1% of it or 20% of it for a farm. So what can we do about this? So a scheme was devised. And I'll come back to this lake in a second. Let me tell you a few stories about that. The farmers also had, we're kind of in duck country here, aren't we? Yes. So I think that this is Guy's Walk. I really do. Because the stories from these people that live, the farmers around this lake, when they were talking about the environment, about their farms, about what they wanted, said that there were tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of canvasback ducks that came to this area and hung out for weeks, if not months at a time, and were eating wapito or things around the wapito, frogs, whatever, and they were being sort of hunted by all of these sort of weekend warriors from Portland. They were coming down here, setting up duck blinds all around the lake, and shooting ducks in the lake all on the weekends. And then they were so lazy, apparently, they just left the ducks in the lake. Yeah. So the farmers were upset, not because all these ducks are being killed, but because people would leave them behind, and it would smell really bad the next week. So, huge environment. So, major then environment for plants, for animals, major resource area for the tribes. In fact, in 1851, the Tualatin tribe said, we want this area as our reservation, which is all around this lake. This is the lake right there. They didn't get it because that treaty was never ratified, but that's what they wanted, because it was a major economic resource for them, a major food resource. They really respected it. So, so by 1935, and I'll show you what the efforts look like in the other map, drain fields were built, drainage was built enough so that they drained off this lake completely, and destroyed this environment for wapito and for ducks. I think these efforts to drain the valley, make it more arid for farming, literally destroyed the population of ducks that we should have in Oregon. And I think that people from the University of Oregon should be upset. Because we're the ducks, right? So, do something about it. Anyway, so that's my little joke for the day. All right, so let's get into the meat of how this all happened. So the valley today is completely like agriculture. Only 1% of the valley is assumed to be native landscape. So this is up on Pearson Butte. I looked out and took all these pictures. I'm like, holy crap, everything is ag. There's no native landscape except for maybe these narrow river corridors. That's just the way it is. And we've grown up with that. We don't know anything else, right? Most of us don't know anything else. This is what Lake LaBiche looks like. I was interested in Lake LaBiche because I grew up in Salem. When I was a kid, a teenager, I went up here and I got a job harvesting, or not harvesting, but weeding the onion fields. And not a really fun job, so I was really happy when I got pneumonia. But, you know, it's the thing you do. Not a lot of jobs in Salem at the time. So, but today, it's still onion fields and blueberries and hazelnuts today. It's a giant landscape. And this is the GLO map image I had. It was so big, I had to put together from 1 to 3 different map images. So it's this giant, you know, complex lake structure, the central lake, and these are all the swales off the lake that happen when it rains. So raining and so snow melt coming down the Pudding River, partially drains into this area, fills up these things, and farmers here, just like at Wapta Lake, complained a lot that these fields in these areas would be drowned out by the swales. Like, we can't use all of our land because of this water, so we got to do something to get rid of it. So it turns out they began working with the OSU Experimental Agricultural Station and began devising new ways of managing water. One of the ways has turned into drain tiling. Maybe you guys know about that, putting drain tiles, like ceramic drain tiles under the land, and I guess they're like 2 feet apart or so, 18 inches down, and then that constantly drains your land out to the local creek or ditch or whatever it is. The other one is ditching. So what these people did before, when they're kind of developing all this stuff, back in around I think they started in 1913, is they attracted investors, land investors from California, the Hayes brothers. The Hayes brothers were recipients of the Hayes fortune from the San Jose Mercury News, which, you know, if you go back to their history, they were gold miners too, all that stuff. So they come to Oregon, they invested in 1,000 acres in this area. This land here is called wasted land, and it's worth $1 an acre. This land out here is productive land. So they bought acreage in this area, and didn't cost them a ton of money, and then they spent $150,000 of their own money to put a ditch from the lake all the way to the Willamette River. That lake today is called LaBiche Creek. It goes right through the center of Kaiser. And other farmers in the other built their own ditches. There's a thing called the Jones ditch, another thing. And so all these 2 technologies, ditching and then drain tiling in the area, in time, in a couple of years, we were able to drain off this whole complex. It took another couple decades to put in they had eventually put in a dam up here. So by 1960 or 61, they were completely controlling the water of the area. But in this early period, they were controlled enough to have a better, you know, harvest of their crops. This area was turned into complete arid landscape, and this land is all, again, black peat soil, like the best you can imagine soil you can grow in. So the lake is gone. When I was growing up in Salem, there was no lake. It's called Lake LaBiche. So I was like, what's going on? Why is there not a lake there when it's called Lake LaBiche? So I figured out what happened. They destroyed it. And so we didn't have a ton of information about the lake. I knew, like Wapta Lake, it had to be a major resource for the Caliqueens in the valley. In these areas, and we have a few descriptions from the newspaper, there were like tens of thousands of animals. There were bears, there were cougars, there were deer and elk in here. There were small animals. There were all these like marshland plants. And I suspected there was Wapto, and I was able to confirm that by at least one account that there was also Wapto here. And then we have one ethnographic account from the tribes, from the Malala tribe, saying that yes, they would go to Lake LaBiche and collect Wapto. We don't have anything from the Caliqueens, but we've probably done the same thing. So, so by 1918 it was completely drained. alternative farmland, more productive land, worthful land, not worthless. So that's what happened. That's what happened here. This also happened at Wapta Lake. One of the brothers from this project, they eventually sold off most of their land after it was drained. Their land values went through the roof. And so they made a boatload on this by selling off a good portion of land. One brother took his proceeds up to Wapta Lake, and he was the one that did the project to dig the drain fields to the 12th River and drain off Wapta Lake in 1935. The other brother went down to Salem and bought a big parcel of land in northeast Salem that we now call Hayesville, after him. So, that's how Oregon's formed, by investors. So, we're really interested in what we do here. There's a man who has put his land, his 70 acres into conservation some 20 years ago, maybe 24 years ago now. And he invites us out there to look at it. It's in the midst of all of these onion fields. He used to be an onion farmer. He got tired of doing that. And so we go out there all the time, and in the winter, there was enough rain to recreate a lake here before it drained off. And there's your image of Mount Hood in the background. So anyway, so this is maybe something like what it looked like in the past with all of these waterfowl out here. So that was exciting. We also have found that he started reporting this wapta regrowing on the property. He didn't plant it. It came back by itself. And I think because of that winter rains and all that flooding that happened on the land, which is probably what it should be like, the seeds from the wapta were spread around pretty good, a good distribution. So we went back this summer. I'm still going to go back one more time this summer. And there's literally wapta growing everywhere. It's not in 4 small plots like it was back a few years ago. Now it's everywhere. I think in a couple of years that the whole lake bed is going to be full of wapta. So it's coming back by itself. This is what wapta looks like. It's a native plant that people, like I said, would eat, roast it up and eat it. At this time of the year, it's going into decline. It's starting to look like this. Into September, it's going to be kind of like this. You go out there and dig it, and then if you have enough of it, you can cook it up and eat it. So, the valley used to be more like this. There's a couple more images to share with you like that. I went to the GLO maps to try and find a little bit more evidence. And if you start looking through GLO maps from each area of the valley, you start to find lots of wetlands pointed out. So this one is by Rickerall. This is a wet camas prairie in this area, and there it is right there. So this is an area that clearly tribes would have gone to harvest camas, the bulb. We have a place, I put together a few maps. Lake Lavish, clearly a big wetland. There's a place called, it was written as Poison Lake. I think it's actually Poisson Lake, which means fish lake. And then Miry Swamp or Slough. And then out in the Tualatin Basin, these areas where the Killen wetlands are, there's these giant wetland area out there, another giant wetland that comes into the valley here. So this is not just a small feature of the landscape, it's everywhere. Down here, south of Eugene, Springfield, this I-5 goes right down through the middle of this right here. So this is Camas Swale. There's a sign on the highway, you've probably seen it. So this was a major Camas site, and we have evidence from the settlers that Native people were harvesting Camas on that site. So really interesting. Again, a major feature of the landscape. So it turns out that wetland environments are probably the most, or pretty dominant on the landscape. This is something that we have to begin to think about and figure into all of our descriptions of the valley, the way it originally was, and the culture of the tribes. Something like this would have been normal. The native plants would survive fine. Camas is fine in a wetland environment. I even went further back to the 1841 Wilkes expedition notes, things that are not published, they're handwritten journals. from Henry L. and George Emmons. And in September 10th, 1841, we're almost on that anniversary right now, aren't we? So they were walking down by the Long Tom River, and they found this giant lake. They call it Lake Lamalee, 80 feet in width, 3/4 mile in width and length, and about a foot deep, a square. So this is a very consistent feature of the valley. Doing a little bit of research in soil science, I found that in the valley that we had this layer of clay, and apparently I heard like yesterday that that clay layer may be the decomposed remnants of Mount Mazama eruption. So that clay creates a water barrier so that so these wetlands, these swales, they stick around a long time, and it allows for the gradual filtering out of the water into the lower system. So that's why these things stick around, because they haven't been plowed and destroyed. So that's pretty interesting. So this has become a very dominant feature. I've been going out to a place on Minto Brown Island Park in Salem, and there's your camas flower, for those that don't know what camas is. And then in the background here is all this juncus, and this is a reed that people would sort of weave with. The Californians actually almost exclusively wove with this for their soft basketry. In 1922, or sorry, 2022, I went out there, took a lot of pictures, and then about a day after it rained, it disappeared in the valley. This is one of Minto's fields, called a farm field. So he was farming this field before drainage technology was figured out, so we never did it. So so this field filled up with water, probably because there's probably a clay barrier under the soil here, and there was actually deep enough that there was a fish out here, a big fish, and he was flapping his wings and stuff. So anyway, this was here for a couple days, and then a couple days later, it disappears. The native plants do fine. The juncus has no problem. The camas is doing fine. But any kind of agricultural plants are going to have a problem. So that is pretty prominent. So this is all this process of reconstructing what things would have been like in the past, trying to get past our own perceptions nowadays.
Did you say the juncus was what they weaved the baskets with?
Juncus, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
And then I wanted to bring in some fire discussion on this because a lot of people are really interested in cultural fire. I don't know if you guys want to talk about fire up here. Is it too traumatizing? Anyway, let's go there for a second, okay? I'll be gentle. Back in the day, the Californians and other tribes would set fire to areas called cultural fire. And in August 11, 1841, when the Wilkes expedition was walking through the valley, they saw it. They saw the fire in the distance. They also saw all the blackened landscape around them in the prairie. So they were constantly, every summer, likely setting fire to the whole valley. Various tribes would do that. And so they're talking about these, and this gives us an idea of what it may have looked like. So all the prairie to the west of us had been burnt and contrasted strongly with the green patches of woods and narrow belts bordering the streams. So these green patches of woods and narrow belts bordering the streams contrasted, which means they were not burnt as much. So that these were barriers to the fire. They stopped the fire, right? That gives us a big hint. So nowadays, if you guys know anything about cultural fire ideas, technologies, they're saying, well, you set fire on a regular basis, there's no fuel to burn like crazy. It's not extreme. So if they're setting fire regularly on the valley floor, there's hardly any fuel except for last year's growth to burn. So therefore, it doesn't really get into these green patches of woods that are probably a little more damp, a little damper than that type of. So they're also setting fire at the time when, on the previous notes, they had been, we had seen swaling grow up, and so there was regular rainfall in the summertime at this time. So they knew exactly when to set fire, when there was rain, so that it wouldn't go out of control. and they saw a string of smoke in the distance curling above a cluster of trees. So that's really interesting too. They were there, likely looking at the fire ahead of them, maybe a day or so ahead of them. And the same thing is captured by David. So, so this is this area here. And so a lot of folks now that do restoration work and fire work are saying, well, we need to bring back fire. The problem I have is, and I have no problem with fire. I think the fire is a good tool, that we don't really know, haven't figured in how water figures into this picture. Because this valley, the Willamette Valley is unique because there's a lot of water here, and we also have fire traditions, right? So if we only bring back fire and don't bring back water, what's going to happen? We could have a problem because the native plants here are adjusted to a landscape where there is water and fire at the same time, almost at the same time. So we're doing some experiments trying to figure out what's going on. These are white oaks. We don't know if they react the same to fire episodes as tan oaks in California, so we're experimenting with that. They could react to the fire, they could react to the smoke. We don't really know yet. But in the figuration of how are we going to restore things in the valley, maybe control fire problems, maybe bring back some of the natural landscapes of the valley, we have to bring into this, notions of water too. We have to begin talking about that because there was some kind of a equation there, right? There's something going on. We have fire, just like water, has been excised from the valley, from many of our landscapes, from the woods, and so we need to bring those back in certain ways so that we can have healthy environments because these native species that we're living amongst are used to that. That's what they live in for tens of thousands of years. And it brings the discussion back to Californian culture. Like, what is it? How does it change the picture of Californians to bring water into the picture? Because if you look at the explanations of what the Californians are like, their culture, we see like, well, they would harvest cannas from the prairies. They don't talk about harvesting cannas from the wet prairies, just prairies. So we need to begin refiguring what that looks like. That's why I painted this guy up with a little bit of water here. So he's not just on a prairie, he's on a wet landscape a lot of times, doing a lot of work. And so how does that change their culture? I don't know. Maybe, for example, the Highway 99s today, the east and west on each side of the valley, they are based on the original territorial highways, right? Which are based on, anybody know?
Out of the water routes.
Indian trails. So they followed Indian trails, expanded them to become wagon roads, right? Why did the natives put the trails up on the hills?
Because they were out of water.
They want to get out of the water. Exactly. That's what I'm thinking. So there's something here. I mean, there's something different here that we need to add into our picture. We start to reconstruct what Californian culture is like, what the valley floor was like, what the landscape was like, and we need to figure this stuff out because it's important. Maybe I'll end there. Bye, thank you.